Rachel had always been a private person, even before she became one of the most powerful people in the county. After 15 years of climbing the political ladder, she finally reached her dream position as county commissioner. But with great power came great scrutiny, and Rachel learned quickly that privacy was a luxury she had to fight for. Every day brought new challenges. Angry residents calling about potholes, developers pushing for permits, budget meetings that stretched until midnight. The constant pressure of making decisions that affected thousands of people was exhausting. Rachel loved her job, but she desperately needed a place where she could just be herself. Not Commissioner Johnson, not the woman who decided where tax money went. Just Rachel. That's why when she saw the house in Willowbrook Estates, she knew it was perfect. The two-story colonial sat on a quiet street lined with oak trees. The front yard had enough space for a small garden, something she'd always wanted but never had time for. Best of all, it was 20 minutes away from the county building, far enough that she wouldn't bump into constituents at the grocery store. Willowbrook Estates wasn't the fanciest neighborhood, but it was clean and well-maintained. The houses were modest but charming, with brick facades and neat lawns. A security gate at the entrance made her feel safe, and the Homeowners Association promised to keep property values stable. Rachel had dealt with HOAs before at her previous home. Usually, they were just concerned with keeping grass cut and houses painted. Nothing too complicated. The real estate agent, a chatty woman named Linda, walked Rachel through the neighborhood on a sunny afternoon. "You'll love it here," Linda said, pointing out the community pool and small playground. "The HOA is very active. They really care about maintaining standards." Rachel nodded politely, but she wasn't really listening. She was already imagining herself sitting on the back porch with a cup of coffee, reading something other than budget reports for once. Maybe she'd plant tomatoes in the backyard, or get a small dog. Simple pleasures that her busy life had pushed aside. When Rachel moved in on a crisp October morning, several neighbors came by to introduce themselves. There was Mrs. Peterson from next door, a retired teacher who brought homemade cookies. The young couple across the street, both nurses at the local hospital, offered to help carry boxes. Everyone seemed friendly and normal. Rachel was careful not to mention her job. When people asked what she did for work, she simply said she worked for the county. Technically true, but vague enough to avoid follow-up questions. She'd learned that once people knew she was a commissioner, conversations became different. Suddenly, everyone had a complaint about road construction or wanted to know why their property taxes went up. For the first few weeks, life in Willowbrook Estates was everything Rachel had hoped for. She established a routine that felt wonderfully ordinary. Early morning jogs around the neighborhood before heading to the office. Quick trips to the corner store for milk and bread. Evening walks where she could decompress from whatever crisis had dominated her day. Her home office was set up in the spare bedroom upstairs. Rachel had insisted on keeping some work at home, partly because county business never really stopped, but also because she enjoyed the quiet productivity of working from her kitchen table on weekends. No interruptions from staff. No scheduled meetings every 30 minutes. Just her, a stack of documents, and the peaceful sounds of suburban life outside her window. The house itself was perfect for her needs. The previous owners had taken excellent care of it. Fresh paint, updated kitchen, hardwood floors that gleamed in the afternoon sun. Rachel spent her first month making small improvements. She hung family photos in the hallway, bought new curtains for the living room, set up a small herb garden by the kitchen window. For someone who spent her days managing a county budget of millions of dollars, there was something deeply satisfying about choosing throw pillows and arranging furniture. These were decisions that affected only her, with consequences no more serious than whether the couch looked better against the north wall or the south wall. The neighborhood itself seemed like something from a movie about ideal American life. Kids rode bikes on sidewalks. Parents pushed strollers to the community mailboxes. On weekends, the smell of barbecue drifted from backyards while families gathered around picnic tables. Rachel found herself relaxing in ways she hadn't in years. She started small traditions that made the house feel like home. Sunday morning coffee on the front porch while reading the newspaper. Wednesday evening walks to the community pond where ducks gathered near a small fountain. Friday night takeout from the Chinese restaurant down the street, eaten while watching old movies on her laptop. But the thing Rachel loved most was the anonymity. Here, She wasn't the person responsible for deciding whether to build a new library or fix the county roads. She was just the quiet woman in the blue house who waved when she got her mail, and sometimes worked in her garden wearing old jeans and a baseball cap. The homeowners association seemed reasonable enough. Rachel received a welcome packet with rules about trash pickup days, pool hours, and basic guidelines about maintaining property. Nothing seemed unreasonable. Keep grass cut to reasonable length. No loud music after 10 p.m. Paint colors should be approved if they were dramatically different from existing ones. Rachel had no intention of painting her house anyway. The soft gray color was perfect, complementing the dark green shutters and the small flower garden she was planning for spring. She read through the HOA guidelines once and filed them away, confident that her naturally neat habits would keep her well within any reasonable community standards. What Rachel didn't know was that the current HOA president had very different ideas about what constituted reasonable standards. And more importantly, she had no idea that her carefully maintained anonymity was about to become both her greatest protection and her most dangerous vulnerability. As autumn turned to winter, Rachel settled deeper into her double life. Commissioner by day, handling million-dollar decisions and mediating disputes between angry citizens. Quiet homeowner by evening, learning the names of her neighbors' dogs and figuring out which grocery store had the best produce section. It was exactly the balance she had been searching for. A place where she could be completely ordinary, completely anonymous, completely at peace. She had worked too hard and sacrificed too much to get where she was professionally. This house, this neighborhood, this simple life after hours felt like the reward she had earned. But Rachel should have paid more attention to those HOA guidelines. And she definitely should have been more curious about why several longtime residents seemed nervous whenever they talked about the homeowners association. Because in a few short weeks, her perfect sanctuary was about to become the center of a battle she never saw coming. The first notice appeared on Rachel's door on a Tuesday morning in late November. She almost missed it, rushing out to an early budget meeting at the county office. The small white envelope was tucked under her door knocker, formal and official looking. Inside was a typed letter on Willowbrook Estates letterhead. "Dear resident," it began, "it has come to our attention that your mailbox does not conform to community standards. The current color appears to be standard black. However, our guidelines specify midnight black. Sherwin-Williams Color Code 6258. Please remedy this violation within 7 days to avoid a $50 fine." Rachel stared at the letter, reading it twice to make sure she understood correctly. Her mailbox was black. It had been black when she bought the house. She walked to the curb and examined it closely. It looked exactly like every other mailbox on the street. Black metal, standard size, nothing unusual about it. She called Mrs. Peterson next door that evening. "Did you get a letter about your mailbox?" "Oh, no, dear," Mrs. Peterson said, but her voice sounded nervous. "Mine must be the right color. But you know, the HOA is very particular about these things. Probably easier to just repaint it." Rachel wanted to argue, but she was tired from a long day dealing with road construction complaints. $20 for a can of midnight black paint seemed easier than fighting over something so trivial. She spent her Saturday morning painting the mailbox, wondering why anyone cared about the difference between regular black and midnight black. 2 weeks later, another notice appeared. This time it was about her garden gnome. Rachel had bought the small ceramic gnome at a craft fair, thinking it was cute sitting among her winter pansies. The gnome was maybe 8 inches tall, painted in cheerful red and blue, holding a tiny fishing pole. Her neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, had complimented it just the week before. The letter was longer this time. Decorative lawn ornaments must be consistent with community aesthetics as outlined in Section 4.2 of the HOA guidelines. Garden gnomes are considered inappropriate for the upscale image our community maintains. Please remove this item within 5 days. Rachel pulled out her copy of the HOA guidelines and read Section 4.2. It mentioned that decorative items should be tasteful and appropriate, but gave no specific examples of what was forbidden. The language was so vague it could mean anything. This time she decided to call the HOA office directly. A woman answered on the third ring. "Willowbrook Estates HOA, this is Patricia." "Hi, I'm calling about a notice I received regarding a garden gnome. I've read the guidelines and I'm not clear on why it violates community standards." There was a pause. "What's your address?" Rachel gave her house number. "Oh, you're the new resident. Yes, Mrs. Whitmore flagged your property for several violations. The gnome needs to go. If you have other questions, you can attend the monthly meeting next Thursday. Who is Mrs. Whitmore? She's our HOA president, very dedicated to maintaining our community's reputation. Rachel hung up feeling frustrated but not wanting to escalate things over a garden gnome. She moved it to her back porch where it sat among her herb pots hidden from street view, but the notices kept coming. In December, she received a warning about excessive bird feeding because she had put up a small feeder near her kitchen window. She was told that attracting birds created unsanitary conditions and violated health standards. Rachel had watched cardinals and blue jays visit the feeder every morning while she drank her coffee. It was one of the small pleasures that made her house feel like home. After Christmas, there was a complaint about her wind chimes. The 3 small metal tubes hung from her front porch, making gentle sounds when the breeze caught them. The notice claimed they created noise pollution and were inappropriate for a family neighborhood. By January, Rachel was getting a new notice almost every week. Her welcome mat was the wrong size. Her porch light was too bright. She received a $50 fine for leaving her trash can out 4 hours past pickup time, even though she had been stuck in an emergency county meeting that ran until midnight. The breaking point came in February. Rachel had been dealing with a county budget crisis for weeks, working 16-hour days trying to balance emergency funding for snow removal with regular operating expenses. She was exhausted, surviving on coffee and determination, falling into bed each night only to wake up early to another day of impossible decisions. That Tuesday evening, she arrived home to find another envelope. This time, the fine was for parking her car in her own driveway. Rachel read the notice 3 times, certain there was a mistake. County government vehicles are prohibited from overnight parking in residential driveways. Such vehicles create an inappropriate commercial appearance and lower property values. Fine. $500. Payment due within 10 days. Her car was a simple gray sedan identical to thousands of others on the road. The only thing that identified it as a county vehicle was a small sticker on the rear window that most people wouldn't even notice. She had been parking in her own driveway every night for 4 months without any problems. Rachel sat in her car for a long moment, staring at the notice. She was tired of being reasonable, tired of complying with ridiculous demands, tired of having her peaceful home life disrupted by someone who seemed determined to find fault with everything she did. She walked next door to talk to Mrs. Peterson, hoping to get some perspective on what was happening. Mrs. Peterson opened the door but didn't invite Rachel in like she usually did. She glanced nervously up and down the street before speaking in a low voice. "Oh dear, you got another notice? This one is about my car. In my own driveway. Have you ever heard of anything so ridiculous?" Mrs. Peterson's eyes darted around again. "You should probably just follow the rules. Mrs. Whitmore doesn't like it when people argue." "Who exactly is this Mrs. Whitmore? I've never even met her." "She's been HOA president for 8 years, very thorough about enforcing rules." "Look, Rachel, I like you, but you should know that people are talking. Mrs. Whitmore thinks you're causing trouble." "Trouble? I've done everything they've asked. I painted my mailbox. I moved my gnome. I took down my bird feeder." Mrs. Peterson looked genuinely scared now. "That's just it. She says people who comply too easily are usually hiding something. She thinks you might be some kind of, I don't know, criminal or something. She's been asking questions about your job, your background." Rachel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the February evening. "What kind of questions? Where you work exactly? Why you're so secretive? Why you get mail from government offices sometimes?" Mrs. Peterson stepped closer and whispered, "She hired someone to look into your background, some kind of investigator." That night, Rachel sat in her home office, looking out at the quiet street she had fallen in love with just a few months earlier. Everything looked the same, but something fundamental had changed. Her sanctuary had become a battlefield, and she was being systematically targeted by someone she had never even met. The worst part was that Mrs. Whitmore was partially right. Rachel was hiding something. Not anything criminal or dangerous, but her real identity as one of the most powerful people in local government. The same position that gave her the knowledge and resources to fight back also made her vulnerable, if discovered by the wrong person. Rachel had spent years learning to pick her battles carefully. But this was her home, her peace, her one escape from the pressures of public life. And someone was trying to take that away from her, one ridiculous notice at a time. As she sat there, Rachel made a decision. She was done being reasonable, done complying with arbitrary demands, done being intimidated in her own neighborhood. Tomorrow she would start fighting back. She just didn't know yet that Mrs. Whitmore was already several steps ahead of her. Rachel first noticed the patrol car on a Thursday evening in late February. She was working late in her home office, reviewing budget proposals for the county's new infrastructure project, when movement outside her window caught her attention. A white SUV with Community Safety Patrol written in bold blue letters was slowly cruising down her street. That was odd. Willowbrook Estates had always used a simple security service. One guard who drove around in a small white car a few times each night, mostly just checking that the front gate was secure and the community pool area was locked up. This vehicle was different, bigger, more official looking. Rachel watched as the SUV stopped in front of the house across the street. Two men got out, both wearing dark uniforms that looked almost like police gear. They walked up to the front door and knocked. Through her window, she could see her neighbors, the young nurse couple, answering the door. The conversation lasted several minutes, with the men taking notes on clipboards. The next morning, Rachel ran into the husband, David, as he was getting his mail. "Everything okay last night?" she asked casually. "I saw some security people at your house." David looked uncomfortable. "Oh, that? Yeah. They said someone complained about our garbage cans being out too early. Wanted to verify what time we usually put them out. That seems like a lot of trouble for garbage cans." "That's what I thought, but they said the HOA hired them to do more thorough enforcement. Make sure everyone follows the rules properly." David lowered his voice. "Between you and me, it felt kind of intense, like they were interrogating us or something." Rachel felt a knot forming in her stomach. In her professional life, she worked closely with real law enforcement. She knew the difference between community security and something more serious. What David was describing sounded like the latter. Over the next week, Rachel began paying closer attention to the evening patrols. The SUV appeared every night around 8 o'clock, sometimes with one person, sometimes with two. They would park at different locations throughout the neighborhood, sitting for long periods as if conducting surveillance. She noticed they always carried clipboards and what looked like cameras. The strangest part was how they interacted with residents. Rachel watched through her upstairs window as they approached Mrs. Chen, the elderly woman who lived 3 houses down. Mrs. Chen was known for her beautiful garden, which she tended to at odd hours because the daytime heat was too much for her. The 2 uniformed men surrounded Mrs. Chen while she was watering her flowers at around 9 p.m. Even from a distance, Rachel could see that Mrs. Chen looked frightened. The conversation went on for nearly 20 minutes, with the men taking extensive notes. When they finally left, Mrs. Chen hurried inside and didn't come out for the rest of the evening. Rachel decided to check on her the next day. She found Mrs. Chen in her backyard, but the older woman was visibly nervous. "Oh, hello, dear," Mrs. Chen said, but she kept glancing toward the street as if expecting someone to appear. "I wanted to see how you're doing. I noticed some security people talking to you last night." Mrs. Chen's face went pale. "They said someone complained about me being in my yard after dark. Said it looked suspicious, me moving around with a flashlight and all. They wanted to know what I was doing, how often I come out here, whether I've seen anything unusual in the neighborhood." "What kind of unusual things?" "That's what I asked them, but they wouldn't say. Just kept asking if I'd noticed any residents acting strangely, or having visitors at odd hours." Mrs. Chen lowered her voice to almost a whisper. "Rachel, they asked specific questions about you." Rachel's blood went cold. "About me? What kind of questions?" "They wanted to know about your schedule. What time you leave for work. What time you come home. Whether you have overnight guests. They seemed very interested in your car. Asked if it was always the same vehicle or if you drove different ones sometimes." The professional part of Rachel's brain immediately went into alert mode. This wasn't normal HOA enforcement. This was surveillance. Someone was specifically gathering information about her routines, her visitors, her activities. The question was why. That weekend, Rachel decided to do some investigating of her own. She had access to resources that most residents didn't, and it was time to use them. She started by photographing the patrol vehicles from her upstairs window, making sure to capture the license plate numbers clearly. On Monday morning, she ran the plates through the county's motor vehicle database. What she found made her stomach drop. The vehicles were registered to a company called Titan Security Services. Rachel had heard that name before, but she couldn't immediately remember where. She dug deeper, accessing public records and business registration databases. Titan Security Services had been in business for 12 years, providing private security for businesses and residential communities. But as Rachel read through their history, red flags started appearing everywhere. 3 years ago, Titan had been investigated by the state for employing guards who impersonated police officers. 2 years ago, they were sued by a business owner who claimed their guards had illegally detained customers. Last year, they had been fined for using equipment and uniforms that too closely resembled actual law enforcement. But the detail that made Rachel's hands shake was buried in a news article from 6 months ago. Titan Security Services had been hired by an HOA in a neighboring county to enhance community enforcement. Within 3 months, that community was in chaos. Residents complained of harassment, illegal searches, and intimidation tactics. Several families had moved away. The local police department had eventually intervened and Titan's contract was terminated. Now they were in Willowbrook Estates, and they were specifically watching her. Rachel spent her lunch break that Monday driving through her neighborhood, studying things she had never paid attention to before. She noticed that the men in the Titan vehicles carried equipment that looked very much like police gear. Handcuffs, radios, what appeared to be tasers. Their uniforms were dark blue with badges and patches that, from a distance, could easily be mistaken for real law enforcement. That evening, she called her friend Lieutenant Morrison from the county sheriff's department. They had worked together on several community safety initiatives, and she trusted his judgment. "Hey, Tony, I need to ask you something off the record. Have you heard of a company called Titan Security Services?" There was a pause. "Where did you hear that name?" "They're doing security in my neighborhood." "Why?" "Rachel, those guys are bad news. We've had multiple complaints about their methods. They train their guards to act like police officers without actually saying they are. It's a gray area legally, but it causes a lot of problems." "What kind of problems?" "Residents think they're dealing with real cops, so they comply with things they don't have to comply with. Titan's guards ask to search cars, enter homes, demand identification. Most people don't know they can say no." Rachel felt sick. "Can they legally do that?" "In a private community like yours, the laws are complicated. The HOA can hire private security, and they can enforce certain rules. But Titan pushes those boundaries way too far. We've been watching them for months, waiting for them to cross a clear legal line." After hanging up, Rachel sat in her living room looking out at the quiet street that had once felt so safe. Everything made sense now. Mrs. Whitmore hadn't just hired more security. She had hired a company known for aggressive tactics and questionable methods. The investigation into Rachel's background, the detailed questions about her schedule, the intimidation of other residents. It was all connected. But why was she being specifically targeted? What was Mrs. Whitmore looking for? As if summoned by her thoughts, the white Titan SUV appeared at the end of her street. Rachel watched as it parked directly across from her house and sat there, engine running for nearly an hour. She could see 2 figures inside, occasionally lifting what looked like cameras or binoculars. They weren't even trying to hide their surveillance anymore. Rachel realized that whatever was coming, it was going to happen soon. Mrs. Whitmore and her enforcement team were escalating their tactics, moving from harassment to intimidation to outright surveillance. The question was what they planned to do with whatever information they were gathering. As county commissioner, Rachel had the power and knowledge to fight back. But as just another resident of Willowbrook Estates, she was as vulnerable as Mrs. Chen or any other neighbor who found themselves in Titan's crosshairs. The irony wasn't lost on her. She spent her days protecting the rights of county residents, making sure law enforcement operated within proper boundaries, ensuring that government power wasn't abused. But here in her own neighborhood, she was watching a private company do exactly what she worked to prevent in her professional life. The white SUV finally drove away just after 10 p.m., but Rachel knew they would be back. Tomorrow night and the night after that and every night until whatever they were planning finally happened. She just had no idea how soon that would be. The morning of March 15th started like any other Tuesday. Rachel woke up early, made her usual cup of coffee, and checked the weather while scanning through her emails. She had a crucial county budget meeting at 10 a.m., one that would determine funding for several community programs. The kind of meeting that could affect thousands of lives depending on how the votes went. She was running a few minutes behind schedule, so she decided to quickly water her small flower garden before leaving. The tulips she had planted in February were just starting to poke through the soil, and the morning sun made everything look peaceful and normal. Rachel was wearing her favorite navy blue suit, the one she always wore for important meetings, with her county ID badge tucked discreetly in her jacket pocket. As she bent down to adjust the sprinkler near her front steps, she heard car doors slamming in her driveway. 2 men were walking toward her with the confident stride of people who were used to being obeyed. Rachel's first thought was that they looked like police officers. Dark blue uniforms, official-looking badges, serious expressions. But something felt wrong immediately. "Ma'am, please step away from the house and keep your hands where we can see them," the taller man called out. He was probably in his 40s, with graying hair and the kind of authoritative voice that made people automatically comply. Rachel straightened up slowly, her mind racing. In her years as county commissioner, she had worked with law enforcement countless times. She knew how real arrests worked, what proper procedures looked like, and these men were already making mistakes. "Is there a problem, officers?" she asked, trying to keep her voice calm while her brain cataloged every detail. Wrong badge design, the star shape was off. Uniform patches that didn't match any local police department. No visible body cameras, which every real officer in the county was required to wear. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for violation of community ordinances and disturbing the peace," the second man announced. He was younger, maybe early 30s, and seemed nervous. His hand kept moving toward what looked like handcuffs on his belt. Rachel's professional training kicked in completely. These were not real police officers. The charges they mentioned weren't even real crimes. Community ordinances were civil matters, not criminal ones. And disturbing the peace? She had been watering flowers in her own front yard at 7:30 in the morning. "I'm going to need to see your badges and identification," Rachel said firmly, "and I'd like to know which department you're with." The older man stepped closer and Rachel could see his badge more clearly. It looked official from a distance, but up close the details were wrong. The serial number was in the wrong place. The department name was too generic. And most importantly, there was no individual badge number which every real officer would have prominently displayed. "Ma'am, we don't have time for games. You need to come with us now," he said, pulling out plastic zip-tie restraints instead of proper handcuffs. Real police officers used metal handcuffs, and they followed specific procedures for arrests that these men were completely ignoring. Rachel realized she was in serious danger, but she also realized she had an advantage these men didn't know about. They thought they were dealing with just another neighborhood resident who would be intimidated by fake authority. They had no idea they were trying to illegally detain one of the most powerful people in county government. But Rachel made a calculated decision. Instead of immediately revealing who she was, she would play along and gather as much evidence as possible. Every detail she could remember would be crucial for the criminal charges these men were about to face. "What's your badge number, officer?" she asked the older man, knowing he couldn't provide a legitimate answer. "Badge number 447, he said without hesitation. Rachel memorized it, knowing she could verify later that no such badge number existed in any local department. "And which department are you with?" There was a slight pause. "County Enforcement Division," the younger man said, but he glanced at his partner uncertainly. Rachel almost laughed. There was no County Enforcement Division. She would know. She helped oversee the county budget that funded all legitimate law enforcement. These men had clearly been given a script, but they didn't understand it well enough to answer basic questions. "I'm going to need to verify your credentials before I go anywhere with you," Rachel said. "You understand that's my right?" The older man was getting frustrated. "Ma'am, you're interfering with an official investigation. If you don't comply immediately, we'll have to use additional charges." More fake legal language. Rachel was building a solid case against these men with every word they spoke. But she was also getting angry. Not just at them, but at whoever had sent them. Someone had hired these people to intimidate her, to illegally detain her, possibly to assault her. This wasn't just harassment anymore, this was serious criminal activity. "What investigation?" she asked. "I haven't been told what I'm accused of doing." The younger man consulted a small notebook. "Multiple violations of homeowner association rules. Failure to comply with community standards. Suspicious behavior reported by neighbors." Rachel knew that even if those things were true, which they weren't, none of them were criminal matters. HOA violations were civil issues handled through fines or civil court. No real police officer would arrest someone for having the wrong color mailbox. I work closely with law enforcement in this county, Rachel said carefully, not quite revealing her position but testing their reaction. I'm going to need to verify your credentials with your supervisors before we proceed. Both men exchanged glances. The uncertainty in their eyes told Rachel everything she needed to know. They weren't prepared for someone who knew how the system actually worked. They were used to dealing with frightened residents who didn't understand their rights. "Ma'am, we don't have time for this," the older man said, moving closer with the zip ties. "You need to come with us now." "Where exactly are you planning to take me?" Rachel asked. "Which station? Which booking facility?" Another pause, another uncertain glance between the two men. "County holding facility," the younger one said, but his voice lacked conviction. Rachel knew every detention facility in the county. There was no county holding facility. These men were either planning to take her somewhere unofficial, or they had no real plan at all beyond intimidating her into compliance. She also noticed their vehicle. Instead of a marked police car, they had arrived in an unmarked gray sedan. No police equipment visible inside, no laptop computer that real officers would have, no radio system that connected to actual dispatch. "I'm going to call my attorney," Rachel announced, reaching slowly toward her purse. "No phone calls," the older man said quickly, stepping forward to grab her wrist. That was the moment Rachel knew these men were dangerous. Real police officers would never prevent someone from calling an attorney. In fact, they were required to inform arrestees of their right to legal representation. These men were violating so many laws that Rachel was starting to lose count, but their biggest mistake was grabbing her wrist. Now this was assault, in addition to impersonating police officers, false imprisonment, and whatever conspiracy charges would apply to whoever had sent them. "Gentlemen," Rachel said in the calm, authoritative voice she used in county meetings when someone was about to make a very expensive mistake, "I need you to listen to me very carefully. I work for this county government and I know exactly what legal authority you do and do not have. Right now you are committing several serious felonies." The older man tightened his grip on her wrist. "Ma'am, you're under arrest. You can explain everything at the station." "What station?" Rachel pressed. "Give me the address. Tell me the name of your commanding officer. Show me your warrant." Silence, because of course there was no warrant. No real station. No commanding officer who would claim these men. Rachel realized that these men were probably just hired muscle, who didn't fully understand what they were doing. Someone else was behind this. Someone who wanted her intimidated, frightened, or removed from the neighborhood. The question was whether they planned to actually take her somewhere, or if this was just meant to scare her into moving away. Either way, it was time to end this charade. "I'm going to make this very simple for you," Rachel said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who was used to being obeyed. "You're going to release my wrist, you're going to get in your car, and you're going to leave my property immediately. Or in about 5 minutes, this neighborhood is going to be full of real police officers who will arrest you for impersonating law enforcement." For the first time since they had approached her, both men looked genuinely uncertain. They had no idea that the quiet woman they were trying to intimidate had the power to make good on that threat with a single phone call. The moment the two fake officers hesitated, Rachel knew she had them. The older man's grip on her wrist loosened slightly, and she could see doubt creeping into both their faces. They had expected a frightened homeowner, not someone who questioned their authority and knew exactly what questions to ask. "Look," Rachel said, her voice taking on the tone she used when negotiating with difficult contractors during budget meetings. "I think we all know this situation has gotten out of hand. Why don't you tell me who really sent you here?" The younger man shifted nervously. "Ma'am, we're just doing our job. We got a call about a disturbance. From who? What's the complaint number? Which dispatch center took the call?" Rachel fired off the questions rapidly, watching as both men struggled to answer. "You do realize that impersonating a police officer is a felony, right? 3 to 5 years in state prison." The older man finally released her wrist and stepped back. "We're not impersonating anyone. We're private security." "Then why did you tell me I was under arrest?" "Private security can't arrest people for civil violations." Rachel pulled out her phone. "I'm calling the sheriff's department to sort this out." "Wait," the younger man said quickly. Maybe we can work something out. Rachel paused with her finger over the phone screen. What kind of work something out? Look, we were hired to deliver a message, okay? Mrs. Whitmore wants to meet with you about your behavior in the community. She thinks if you just talk to her, you could work out your differences. Finally, some truth. Rachel had suspected Mrs. Whitmore was behind this, but hearing it confirmed made her anger spike even higher. The HOA president had hired fake police officers to intimidate her into a meeting. The audacity was breathtaking. And you thought the best way to arrange a meeting was to pretend to arrest me? The older man looked uncomfortable. Our instructions were to use whatever methods necessary to get your attention. Whose instructions? Who exactly hired you? Before either man could answer, Rachel heard car doors slamming across the street. Mrs. Peterson was standing in her driveway, clearly having watched the entire confrontation. But she wasn't alone. Mrs. Chen was there too, along with David from across the street and several other neighbors Rachel recognized. More importantly, David was holding his phone up, clearly recording everything. The fake officers noticed the audience at the same time Rachel did. The younger man looked panicked. We should go, he said to his partner. You're not going anywhere until real police get here, Rachel said firmly. You just admitted to being hired to intimidate me. That's conspiracy, harassment, and impersonating law enforcement. I'm not letting you walk away to do this to someone else. She dialed 911, keeping her eyes on both men while she spoke to the dispatcher. This is County Commissioner Rachel Johnson at 47 Maple Street in Willowbrook Estates. I need officers here immediately. 2 men have just attempted to unlawfully detain me while impersonating police officers. The effect of those words was immediate and dramatic. Both fake officers went pale. The neighbors across the street stopped talking and stared. Even Mrs. Peterson's mouth fell open. Did she just say county commissioner? David asked loudly enough for everyone to hear. Rachel had been hiding her identity for months, but now it was time to use every bit of authority her position gave her. She stayed on the phone with dispatch, providing descriptions of both men and their vehicle while they stood frozen, clearly trying to process what they had just learned. Yes, Commissioner Johnson, the dispatcher said. Units are en route. Are you in immediate danger? Not anymore, Rachel said, looking directly at the older fake officer. I think these gentlemen are starting to understand the magnitude of their mistake. The younger man was already backing toward their car. We need to leave now. But the older man seemed to realize that running would only make things worse. Commissioner, we had no idea who you were. This was just a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding. Rachel's voice carried the same authority she used when dealing with uncooperative department heads. You came to my home with fake badges, fake uniforms, and fake authority. You attempted to unlawfully detain an elected official. This isn't a misunderstanding. This is a felony. In the distance, Rachel could hear sirens approaching. The sound seemed to galvanize the younger fake officer, who was now practically jogging toward their car. But his partner grabbed his arm. If we run now, it looks even worse, the older man said. We need to stay and explain. Explain what? His partner hissed. That we're working for some crazy HOA lady who wanted us to scare a county commissioner. Rachel was recording every word on her phone now, building her case with each panicked sentence they spoke. Around the neighborhood, more residents were coming out of their houses, drawn by the sirens and the commotion. Word was spreading quickly that the quiet woman in the blue house was actually one of the most powerful people in local government. The first sheriff's car arrived within minutes, followed quickly by 2 more. Lieutenant Morrison stepped out of the lead vehicle, and Rachel felt a wave of relief seeing a familiar face. Rachel, what's the situation here? She gestured toward the 2 fake officers who were now standing very still with their hands visible. Tony, meet the Titan security officers I told you about. They just attempted to arrest me for HOA violations while impersonating county law enforcement. Lieutenant Morrison's expression darkened. Are you serious? Dead serious. I have the entire encounter recorded on my phone. They claimed to be from a non-existent county enforcement division, showed fake badges, and attempted to detain me with zip ties. While Morrison and his officers dealt with the fake officers, Rachel walked across the street to talk to her neighbors. The group had grown to include most of the residents from her block, all of them looking stunned. Commissioner Johnson, Mrs. Peterson said uncertainly. You're really a county commissioner? I am, and I'm sorry I wasn't honest about that from the beginning. I just wanted to keep my work life and home life separate. But why were those men trying to arrest you? David asked, still recording with his phone. Because Mrs. Whitmore hired them to intimidate me. This whole harassment campaign, the violations, the fines, the surveillance. It was all designed to force me out of the neighborhood. Mrs. Chen stepped forward, looking angry for the first time since Rachel had known her. She told them to do this? To pretend to be police? That's what they just admitted on camera. The crowd of neighbors began talking among themselves, and Rachel could hear anger building in their voices. Stories started coming out about their own encounters with Titan security, about feeling intimidated and watched, about receiving violations for ridiculous infractions. This explains so much, said a woman Rachel didn't recognize. I got fined $50 for having a dandelion in my lawn. When I tried to appeal, they sent those security guys to my house. They questioned my teenage son about where he goes after school, another neighbor added, made him feel like he was under investigation for something. Lieutenant Morrison approached with an update. Both men are in custody. They've admitted to working for Titan Security under contract with your HOA. We found fake police equipment in their vehicle, including bogus ID cards and counterfeit badges. What about Mrs. Whitmore? That's where this gets interesting. When we ran Titan's current contracts, we found some irregularities. The payment authorization for their services here might not have proper board approval. It looks like Mrs. Whitmore may have hired them using HOA funds without getting the required votes. Rachel felt pieces clicking into place. Embezzlement? Possibly. We'll need to do a full investigation. But if she's been paying a security company thousands of dollars a month without proper authorization, that's theft from the community fund. As Rachel stood in her front yard, surrounded by neighbors who were finally learning the truth about what had been happening in their community, she realized that this confrontation was just the beginning. Mrs. Whitmore had made a catastrophic error in targeting someone with the knowledge and authority to fight back. But more than that, she had united the neighborhood against her. Residents who had been too intimidated to speak up before were now sharing their stories, comparing notes, building a case that went far beyond harassing one person. The fake arrest had backfired completely. Instead of scaring Rachel away, Mrs. Whitmore had revealed her own criminal activity and given Rachel all the evidence she needed to bring the entire scheme crashing down. As the sheriff's cars drove away with the two fake officers in custody, Rachel looked around at her neighbors, people who had been living in fear for months without realizing they had one of the county's most powerful advocates living right next door. Tomorrow, the real investigation would begin, and Mrs. Whitmore was about to learn what happened when you tried to intimidate someone who actually understood how the system worked. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for the next evening, but Rachel spent the entire day preparing like she was going to war. She had called in favors, coordinated with multiple departments, and assembled a team that would ensure Mrs. Whitmore faced the full consequences of her actions. Rachel arrived at the community center an hour early, but she wasn't alone. Lieutenant Morrison was with her, along with Detective Williams from the Fraud Division and assistant. District Attorney Lopez. Behind them came two representatives from the State Attorney General's office and a forensic accountant who specialized in HOA financial crimes. But the person Rachel was most grateful to see was Janet Kim, the investigative reporter from Channel 7 News. Janet had been covering HOA corruption stories for years, and when Rachel called her that morning, she immediately understood the significance of what had happened. A county commissioner targeted by fake police hired by her own HOA, Janet had said over the phone. This is going to be front-page news. The community center was packed. Word had spread throughout Willowbrook Estates about the previous day's events, and residents who hadn't attended an HOA meeting in years were crowding into the small meeting room. Rachel recognized many faces from her street, but there were dozens of people she had never seen before. Mrs. Peterson found Rachel before the meeting started. I can't believe we've been living next to a county commissioner this whole time, she said, but her voice was warm. And I can't believe Mrs. Whitmore tried to have you arrested. How long has she been running things like this? Rachel asked. Years, Mrs. Peterson said quietly. But nobody ever stood up to her before. People were too scared, or they just moved away when things got bad. David from across the street approached with his wife, both of them looking excited and nervous. Commissioner, we've been talking to other neighbors. The stories we're hearing are incredible. Mrs. Whitmore has been using Titan security to intimidate people for months. What kind of stories? The Hendersons on Oak Street were told their teenage daughter couldn't have friends over after 6 p.m. because it was loitering. When they complained, security guards started following their daughter to school. Rachel felt her anger building again. Following a minor to school? And Mrs. Garcia got a $500 fine for speaking Spanish in her own backyard. They said it was disturbing the peace because neighbors complained about not understanding what she was saying. The more Rachel heard, the clearer it became that Mrs. Whitmore had been running a systematic campaign of harassment and discrimination. The fake police incident wasn't an isolated event. It was the escalation of a pattern that had been going on for months. At exactly 7 p.m., Mrs. Whitmore entered the meeting room. She was a tall, thin woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun. She wore a navy blue suit and carried herself with the confidence of someone who was used to being the most important person in any room. Her confidence faltered when she saw the law enforcement officers, the reporters, and the crowd of residents who were all staring at her with expressions ranging from anger to disgust. "What is the meaning of this?" Mrs. Whitmore demanded, looking around the packed room. This was supposed to be a routine board meeting. Rachel stood up from her seat in the front row. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm Rachel Johnson, and I believe you know exactly why we're all here." Mrs. Whitmore's eyes narrowed as she focused on Rachel for the first time. "You're the troublemaker from Maple Street. I was told you were dealt with." "Yesterday." A gasp went through the crowd. Mrs. Whitmore had just admitted in front of dozens of witnesses and a news camera that she knew about the fake arrest attempt. "Actually," Rachel said, walking to the front of the room, "I'm County Commissioner Rachel Johnson. And yesterday your hired security team attempted to unlawfully detain an elected official using fraudulent police credentials." The color drained from Mrs. Whitmore's face. She sat down heavily in her chair at the board table, clearly trying to process what she had just heard. "That's impossible," she said weakly. "You're just a resident here." "I'm a resident, yes. But I'm also the person who oversees the county budget, works with law enforcement daily, and happens to know quite a bit about legal authority and abuse of power." Rachel gestured to Lieutenant Morrison, who stepped forward. "Mrs. Whitmore, you're under investigation for conspiracy, fraud, and misuse of community funds. The 2 men who attempted to detain Commissioner Johnson yesterday are in custody and have provided statements about their employment with your organization." "I don't know what you're talking about," Mrs. Whitmore said, but her voice lacked conviction. Detective Williams opened a folder and began reading. "Titan Security Services has been paid $43,000 from HOA community funds over the past 6 months. These payments were authorized solely by you, without board approval as required by your own HOA bylaws." The crowd erupted in angry murmurs. $43,000 was more than many residents made in a year, and it had been taken from their community fees to pay for harassment and intimidation. Assistant District Attorney Lopez stepped forward next. "Mrs. Whitmore, we've obtained financial records showing that Titan Security's contract was never approved by the HOA board. You've been using community funds for personal vendetta against residents you disagreed with." "It wasn't personal," Mrs. Whitmore protested. "I was maintaining community standards." "By hiring fake police officers?" Rachel asked. "By having security guards follow teenagers to school? By fining residents for speaking Spanish in their own backyards?" More residents stood up to share their stories. The woman who had been fined for dandelions, the family whose daughter had been followed, Mrs. Garcia, who spoke through tears about being told she couldn't speak her native language in her own yard. Mrs. Chen raised her hand. "They questioned me for watering my garden at night, made me feel like a criminal for taking care of my flowers." The forensic accountant Rachel had brought presented his preliminary findings. "Based on the financial records we've reviewed, there are significant irregularities in how HOA funds have been managed. In addition to the unauthorized security payments, there are unexplained expenses totaling over $70,000 that require investigation." Mrs. Whitmore was no longer the confident, controlling person who had entered the room. She looked smaller, older, and increasingly desperate. "I was protecting this community, property values, maintaining standards. Someone had to enforce the rules." "What rules?" Rachel asked. "Show me the HOA guideline that says residents can't speak Spanish." Show me where it says teenagers can't have friends over. Show me where it authorizes you to hire fake police officers. Mrs. Whitmore couldn't answer, because no such rules existed. She had been making up violations and using intimidation to enforce her personal prejudices and need for control. Janet Kim, the reporter, had been filming and taking notes throughout the meeting. She approached Mrs. Whitmore with her microphone. "Mrs. Whitmore, do you have any comment about the criminal charges you're facing?" "I'm not facing any charges," Mrs. Whitmore said, but her voice was shaking. Detective Williams stepped forward again. "Actually, ma'am, you are. You're under arrest for embezzlement, conspiracy, and fraud." As the handcuffs were placed on Mrs. Whitmore's wrists, the room fell silent. Residents who had been terrorized by her authoritarian rule for years watched as she was finally held accountable for her actions. Rachel addressed the crowd as Mrs. Whitmore was led away. "I want everyone here to understand that what happened in this community was not normal. No HOA has the right to harass residents, steal community funds, or hire people to impersonate law enforcement." She looked around the room, making eye contact with as many residents as possible. "You all deserve to live in peace in your own homes. You deserve an HOA that serves your interests, not someone's personal agenda. And you deserve to know that when someone abuses power, there are consequences." The applause started slowly but built until the entire room was standing and clapping, not just for Rachel, but for the idea that their long nightmare was finally over. As the meeting ended and residents began sharing contact information to organize a new HOA board, Rachel felt a deep satisfaction. Mrs. Whitmore had tried to use fake authority to intimidate and control people. Instead, she had encountered real authority wielded by someone who understood both the law and the responsibility that came with power. The story would make headlines across the state. But more importantly, Willowbrook Estates would become a community again, instead of a dictatorship disguised as a homeowners association. Mrs. Whitmore's biggest mistake wasn't just targeting the wrong person. It was believing that authority came from fear and intimidation, rather than legitimacy and service. She had just learned the difference the hard way. The investigation that followed Mrs. Whitmore's arrest was like peeling back layers of an onion. Each discovery led to something worse underneath. Rachel had thought the fake police incident was the most serious crime. But as forensic accountants and state investigators dug deeper into the HOA's finances, they uncovered a web of corruption that shocked everyone involved. 3 days after the emergency meeting, Detective Williams called Rachel with an update that made her stomach turn. "Commissioner, you need to see what we found in Mrs. Whitmore's office. Can you come down to the station?" Rachel cleared her afternoon schedule and drove to the sheriff's department, where Detective Williams had spread financial documents across an entire conference table. The papers told a story of systematic theft that had been going on for nearly 3 years. "It started small," Williams explained, pointing to bank statements from 2022. 500 here, 1,000 there. She was skimming money from the community maintenance fund and covering it up by delaying repairs. That's why the playground equipment was never fixed, Rachel realized, and why the community pool needed emergency repairs every few months. Exactly. But it escalated when she discovered she could create fake vendors and approve payments to herself. Williams showed Rachel a stack of invoices for companies that didn't exist: Sunshine Landscaping, Elite Security Consultants, Premium Property Management, all fake businesses that were really just Mrs. Whitmore taking money from the community fund. The numbers were staggering. Over 3 years, Mrs. Whitmore had stolen more than $200,000 from Willowbrook Estates. Money that should have gone to maintaining the community, fixing roads, and improving common areas had instead been funneled into her personal accounts. "How did nobody notice?" Rachel asked. She was smart about it. She presented budgets to the HOA board that looked reasonable, but she was the only one who actually handled the finances. When residents asked about delayed maintenance or rising fees, she blamed inflation and county regulations. Rachel felt sick thinking about all the residents who had struggled to pay increasing HOA fees while Mrs. Whitmore was literally stealing their money. Families on fixed incomes, young couples trying to save for their first homes, elderly residents living on Social Security. All of them had been victims of this scheme. But the financial crimes were just part of the story. As investigators interviewed more residents, they discovered that Titan Security had been operating far outside any reasonable interpretation of private security work. The security company knew exactly what they were doing. Assistant District Attorney Lopez explained during a meeting the following week. They've been involved in similar schemes in 4 other communities across 2 states. The owner of Titan Security, a man named Vincent Torres, had built a business model around HOA corruption. He would approach authoritarian HOA presidents like Mrs. Whitmore and offer enhanced enforcement services that included intimidation, surveillance, and pseudo-legal actions that skirted the line between private security and impersonating law enforcement. Torres trains his employees to use equipment and uniforms that look like police gear without technically claiming to be police officers. Lopez continued. They rely on people being too intimidated or confused to ask the right questions. Rachel learned that the 2 men who had tried to arrest her were relatively new employees who had been told she was a problem resident who needed to be discouraged from causing trouble. They had no idea they were targeting a county commissioner, and they certainly didn't understand the legal implications of what they were being asked to do. The younger guy, Rodriguez, is cooperating fully, Detective Williams reported. He's terrified and wants to make a deal. The older one, Patterson, has a record of similar incidents in other states. The investigation expanded to include federal charges when it was discovered that Titan Security had been operating across state lines without proper licensing. The FBI got involved when they found evidence that Torres had been running similar schemes in communities from Florida to Arizona. Rachel used her position to ensure that the investigation was thorough and that all victims received justice. She worked with the state attorney general's office to create a task force specifically focused on HOA corruption and private security abuse. This case has opened our eyes to a much bigger problem, the attorney general told Rachel during a conference call. We're finding similar situations in communities across the state. Your experience has given us a roadmap for how to investigate and prosecute these crimes. The legal consequences came swiftly. Mrs. Whitmore was charged with embezzlement, fraud, conspiracy, and violation of civil rights. The evidence was overwhelming. Financial records, recorded conversations, witness testimony from dozens of residents, and her own admissions at the emergency meeting. She tried to claim that she was just trying to maintain community standards and that the financial irregularities were bookkeeping errors. But prosecutors had recordings of her phone calls with Torres discussing specific residents who needed to be dealt with, including detailed plans for the fake arrest attempt. Vincent Torres and his company faced federal charges for operating an unlicensed security business across state lines, conspiracy to impersonate law enforcement, and civil rights violations. The FBI raid on Titan's offices uncovered training materials that explicitly taught employees how to intimidate residents while avoiding technically illegal activities. It's all about creating fear without crossing clear legal lines, one training document explained. Make people think you have more authority than you actually do. The 2 fake officers who had confronted Rachel received different sentences based on their level of cooperation. Rodriguez, the younger man who had seemed genuinely confused during the incident, received 2 years probation and community service in exchange for his testimony against Torres and Mrs. Whitmore. Patterson, who had a history of similar incidents and had grabbed Rachel's wrist during the confrontation, was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison for impersonating a law enforcement officer and assault. Mrs. Whitmore's trial became a media sensation. Janet Kim's initial news report had been picked up by national outlets, and the story of a county commissioner being targeted by her own HOA resonated with people across the country who had their own HOA horror stories. The courtroom was packed with Willowbrook Estates residents when Mrs. Whitmore was sentenced. Rachel sat in the front row not as the victim, but as a representative of everyone who had been hurt by the defendant's actions. Mrs. Whitmore, the judge said during sentencing, you held a position of trust in your community, and you violated that trust in the most egregious way possible. You stole money from families, hired criminals to intimidate your neighbors, and created an atmosphere of fear in what should have been a peaceful residential community. The judge sentenced Mrs. Whitmore to 5 years in federal prison and ordered her to pay full restitution to the HOA, not just the money she had stolen, but additional damages for the harm caused to the community. Her house was seized to help pay the restitution, and she was banned from serving in any HOA leadership position for the rest of her life. Vincent Torres received an even harsher sentence, 12 years in federal prison for running what prosecutors called a criminal enterprise designed to terrorize residential communities. Titan Security was permanently shut down, and Torres was ordered to pay millions in restitution to all the communities his company had victimized. But for Rachel, the most satisfying moment came when she received a letter from the Attorney General's office informing her that their investigation had led to new state legislation specifically designed to prevent HOA abuse. The Homeowner Protection Act created strict oversight requirements for HOA finances, banned the use of private security for enforcement actions, and established clear penalties for HOA board members who violated residents' rights. The law was nicknamed Rachel's Law by the media, though Rachel preferred to think of it as justice for every family who had been victimized by corrupt HOA leadership. 6 months after Mrs. Whitmore's arrest, Rachel received a call from a resident in a community 3 states away. "Commissioner Johnson? My name is Linda Peterson, not related to your neighbor, and I think our HOA president is doing the same things Mrs. Whitmore was doing. Can you help us?" Rachel smiled as she reached for a notepad. "Tell me what's been happening," she said, "because sometimes the most important part of justice isn't just punishing the criminals, it's making sure their victims know they have someone willing to fight for them." 6 months after Mrs. Whitmore's arrest, Rachel stood in her front yard on a warm Saturday morning, finally able to enjoy the simple pleasure of gardening without looking over her shoulder. The transformation in Willowbrook Estates had been remarkable, but it hadn't happened overnight. The first challenge had been rebuilding trust among neighbors who had spent years being afraid to speak to each other. Mrs. Whitmore's reign of terror had created an atmosphere where residents avoided contact, worried that any interaction might be reported as a violation or used against them somehow. Rachel had started small, organizing a community barbecue in the park area that Mrs. Whitmore had declared off-limits for unauthorized gatherings. The invitation went to every household, and Rachel was amazed when nearly 200 people showed up. Families who had been isolated for months finally met their neighbors face to face. "I had no idea so many people were going through the same thing," Mrs. Garcia had told Rachel that day, tears in her eyes. "I thought I was the only one being targeted." The stories that emerged during that first community gathering were both heartbreaking and infuriating. The Henderson family had been fined repeatedly for their teenager having friends over, to the point where their daughter had stopped inviting anyone to their house. An elderly veteran named Frank had been cited for displaying an American flag that was supposedly the wrong size, even though it was identical to flags hanging at government buildings throughout the county. Perhaps worst of all was the Williams family, who had been harassed so relentlessly that they had actually put their house up for sale. Mrs. Whitmore had targeted them with violations for everything from their children's chalk drawings on the sidewalk to the color of their car, which she claimed didn't match community standards. "We were going to move away," Mrs. Williams admitted during the barbecue. "We couldn't afford the fines anymore, and our kids were scared to play outside. If you hadn't stood up to her, we would have lost our home." Rachel realized that rebuilding the community meant more than just getting rid of Mrs. Whitmore. It meant creating new systems that would prevent anyone from accumulating that kind of unchecked power again. The process of electing a new HOA board became a community-wide effort. Instead of the usual situation where a few people made decisions for everyone else, Rachel helped organize informational meetings where residents could learn about HOA governance and understand their rights. The biggest problem was that most people didn't know what the HOA was supposed to do, explained David, who had volunteered to help with the reorganization. Mrs. Whitmore made it seem like she had unlimited authority, but that was never true. Rachel used her experience in government to help draft new HOA bylaws that emphasized transparency and accountability. Every financial decision over $500 would require board approval. All meetings would be open to residents. And most importantly, any enforcement actions would have to follow clear written guidelines that couldn't be changed without a community vote. The new board that was elected reflected the diversity of the community. Mrs. Peterson became the new president, bringing her years of teaching experience to the role. David was elected treasurer, determined to ensure that community funds would never again be misused. Mrs. Chen became the secretary, and several other residents filled the remaining positions. But Rachel's favorite change was the new community guidelines themselves. Gone were the vague rules about maintaining standards that could be interpreted any way someone wanted. Instead, the new rules were specific, reasonable, and focused on actual safety and property maintenance, rather than personal preferences. Residents could now speak any language they wanted in their own yards. Children could play outside without fear of being reported for excessive noise. Garden decorations were welcome as long as they weren't offensive or dangerous. And most importantly, no private security company could be hired without a full community vote and proper oversight. The financial recovery took longer. Mrs. Whitmore's theft had left the community fund nearly empty, and there were years of deferred maintenance to address. But the restitution from her conviction, combined with the seizure of her assets, provided enough money to begin repairs. The community pool, which had been closed for maintenance for 8 months, was finally fixed properly. The playground equipment that had been broken for years was replaced with new, safer structures. The entrance gate, which had been malfunctioning because Mrs. Whitmore had skipped maintenance to pocket the money, was completely rebuilt. Rachel found herself serving as an unofficial advisor to the new board, helping them navigate the complex legal and financial issues involved in running a community association. It wasn't a role she had expected, but it felt natural to use her professional expertise to help her neighbors. The irony is that Mrs. Whitmore was so determined to keep you from being involved in community affairs, Mrs. Peterson told Rachel during one of their monthly planning meetings, but her actions made you the most important person in fixing everything she broke. The story of Willowbrook Estates became a case study in HOA reform. Rachel received calls and emails from residents in communities across the country who were facing similar problems with authoritarian HOA leadership. She worked with the State Attorney General's office to create a guide for residents dealing with HOA abuse, and she testified before the state legislature about the need for stronger oversight of community associations. The most rewarding part for Rachel was watching the community come alive in ways it never had under Mrs. Whitmore's control. Families who had been afraid to decorate for holidays now went all out for every celebration. The community organized movie nights in the park, potluck dinners, and even a small farmer's market where residents could sell vegetables from their gardens. It feels like we're actually neighbors now, instead of just people who happen to live near each other, Frank, the veteran, told Rachel during the community's first 4th of July celebration. Children were running around with sparklers while their parents chatted and laughed, and nobody was worried about violating some arbitrary rule. Rachel's own life had changed dramatically as well. No longer hiding her identity, she had become the informal liaison between the community and county government. When residents had questions about property taxes, zoning issues, or county services, they came to her. It was exactly the kind of direct, personal connection to constituents that had drawn her to public service in the first place. Her house had become a symbol of the community's transformation. The small ceramic gnome was back in her front garden, now joined by several others that neighbors had given her as gifts. Wind chimes hung from her porch, creating gentle music on breezy evenings. Her bird feeder attracted cardinals and blue jays that children loved to watch from the sidewalk. But the change Rachel treasured most was the simple ability to relax in her own home. She could work in her garden without wondering if someone was watching her. She could park her county car in her own driveway without fear of retaliation. She could invite colleagues over for dinner without worrying about unauthorized visitors violations. One evening in late September, exactly 1 year after she had first moved to Willowbrook Estates, Rachel sat on her front porch with a cup of coffee, watching the neighborhood come alive with the sounds of normal family life. Children rode bikes on the sidewalks. Neighbors called greetings to each other across yards. The smell of dinner cooking drifted from open windows. Mrs. Peterson waved from her garden next door, where she was planting fall flowers without fear that someone would cite her for inappropriate seasonal decorations. David and his wife were teaching their kids to play basketball in their driveway, no longer worried about excessive noise complaints. Rachel's phone buzzed with a text message from Janet Kim, the reporter who had covered the story. 1 year, Later, any regrets about not staying anonymous? Rachel smiled as she typed back her response. Best mistake I never made. The community had faced its biggest challenge and emerged stronger. Mrs. Whitmore had tried to rule through fear and intimidation, but she had unknowingly united her neighbors against injustice. In trying to silence one person, she had given an entire community the courage to find their voices. As the sun set over Willowbrook Estates, Rachel realized that this was what she had been looking for all along, not just a place to hide from her responsibilities, but a community where she could use her skills and position to make a real difference in people's daily lives. Sometimes the most important battles aren't fought in government buildings or courtrooms. Sometimes they're fought in your own backyard, by ordinary people who refuse to accept that power means the right to abuse others. Mrs. Whitmore had learned that lesson the hard way. But for Rachel and her neighbors, it had become the foundation of something much better than what they had lost.